As you know, I'm Erica, and I am meeting with my book club today. And this month we were just tasked with reading any adult fiction book. I chose to do historical fiction because that's kind of my favorite. And this is historical fiction with a little bit of a twist. So to get started, one of my all-time favorite books by my all-time favorite author, and this is Stephen King. And this one is called 11/22/63. And this one is a story about Jake Epping. He's a high school English teacher, got a pretty boring life, until one day his friend Al, who runs the local diner, brings him in and is like, I have a secret to tell you. And he's like, I'm dying. He's like, okay, well, what's the big deal? But no, I'm dying because I went back in time and tried to stop JFK from dying. He's like, that makes zero sense, okay? And so turns out there is a time-traveling portal in the back of the restaurant. And that portal will take you back to a certain date in 1958. So the deal is Jake has to go back through that portal to 1958 and live until 1963 and stop Lee Harvey Oswald from killing JFK. But of course, along the way, there's a lot of supernatural elements because it's Stephen King after all. And he falls in love and he tests a lot of the, different elements of like, what would you do if you went back in time? What would you change? It's also surprisingly really historical because it gives you a lot of details about Lee Harvey Oswald that I didn't know anything about him outside of he's the guy that killed JFK. So it's really interesting because it follows the story of Oswald from the time that he comes to America and like his struggles for the 5 years before he actually shoots JFK. So it's a really interesting novel. I will say this is one of my least favorite Stephen King novel endings. But, it's got 860 some pages and 800 of them are amazing. So I still highly, highly recommend reading this book. It is just really, really good. And it answers a lot of those questions of what would you do? What would you change if you could go back in time? All right, up next is another time traveling book by another one of my favorite adult authors, and this one is Timeline by Michael Crichton. It is a more traditional time travel book. So it deals with medieval times, and it deals with some science, because it's Michael Crichton, and it's full of knights and jousts and death. Running for your life, trying not to die. So the basic story goes that some company in the United States has invented a way to travel back in time using quantum energy. They want to test this, so they bring in this expert professor in medieval life and send him back in time to 1357. But of course, he gets stuck there because they can't figure out how to bring him back. So they bring in this team of 4 research students. They all have different aspects of knowledge in medieval life. They were studying under this professor, and they bring them in and they're like, we're going to send you guys back in time, go find the professor, and in the meantime, we're going to figure out how to bring you back, we promise. So they go back in time, they find the professor, but of course there's this big adventure because the professor is being held in a dungeon, and then the one guy falls in love with a girl, and that girl's betrothed, gets really angry, and so there's some jousting, and there's a lot of running and escaping and a lot of really fast-paced adventure in medieval times. So, will they be able to save the professor? Will they be able to fix the machine? Will you learn anything about medieval culture and or quantum energy? You'll have to read the book to find out. All right, up next is The Other Einstein. I don't have the book for this one, but it's really pretty. It's blue. So everybody knows who Albert Einstein is, right? He's the king of science. He invented gravity or something. It's a little more detailed than that. He came up with E equals MC squared. But the thing is, everybody loves Albert Einstein. Well, this is the story of the other Einstein, the first Mrs. Einstein. And her name was Mileva Merrick. And in her own right, she was a genius. She was very, very smart, and she lived in a time when women were not really allowed in science, and they weren't allowed to be smart. So she went against all traditional values, and she went to school, and she was one of the first women that was accepted to the Polytechnic School in Zurich, which happens to be where Albert Einstein was going to school. So she was the only woman in her class full of males, and she had really tried hard to prove herself. And along the way, Albert Einstein falls in love with her. At first, she's like, no, I'm all about science, I work too hard, go away. But of course, he pursues her, and he's really super charming. And eventually, she gives in, and they fall in love, and they get engaged, and then he talks her into pre-consummating their marriage, and she gets pregnant. And at this point, she goes back home, and she's staying with her parents, and he basically says, look, we can't get married because I can't have a child on wedlock. So you just hang out there, I'll come get you eventually. And he never shows up. And he never comes to visit. And he never checks in on the baby. He never even meets the baby. And of course, this starts to be some red flags. And this is just the first in a long line of really douchey events that Albert Einstein goes through in his treatment of Maleva. They do reconcile after that particular baby, but then she turns around and has two more. And she's this really smart lady, and he just treats her like dirt. He treats her like a common housewife and steals a lot of her ideas. And while it's not 100% nonfiction, it is based on true events. All of the things really did happen, but there's a lot of mystery involved in the real story because of the fact that she wasn't well known, and so it's a lot of insinuating on like, this did happen and this did happen, but we're not really sure how we got from A to B. So it's not 100% true, but the facts are in there. And it does change your perspective a little bit on who Albert Einstein is. I mean, he was still a really smart guy that changed the world, but he's, just maybe not an all-star. But really good story nonetheless. Okay, the Night Tiger. We're changing gears a little bit here. These last three are not only historical fiction, but they are also cultural. And the Night Tiger is the story of a couple of people. The first one is Wren. He's a little boy. He's a houseboy. And the doctor that he's taking care of is on the verge of death. And he likes to tell a lot of really superstitious stories, mythological stories about like were-tigers, which are the opposite of werewolves because they are tigers that turn into humans. And then as the professor's dying, he's like, you have to go find my pinky because I cannot be buried not whole. And I lost my pinky a long time ago, and if you don't find this for me, then I'm doomed to roam the earth for an eternity. So this 11-year-old boy is kind of freaking out. He makes this promise, and after the professor dies, he goes on this adventure to find his pinky. He's only got 49 days to do it. Well, at the same time, Jilin is a young girl, older than 11, but she's working at a dance hall, which is very, very risque at that time period, especially for women. It's just dancing for the most part, but it's still really frowned upon. But she's working for this dance hall, and this guy comes in, and he drops a little vial on his way out the door. She picks it up, and it's a finger. So the story kind of follows the two of them while on their quest. She's trying to figure out what to do with this finger, and he's trying to find the finger. And there's a lot of mystery involved because there's also this random tiger that's killing women, and there's another doctor involved. It changes points of view between Jilin and Ren and the other doctor, and their lives and how they intertwine trying to solve this mystery. So will they be able to get the finger back to the grave? Will the guy be doomed to roam for eternity? Will they figure out what their connection is and their destiny is? Who knows? But that's what this book is about. Molokai takes place in Hawaii, describing the beautiful landscapes of Hawaii. And it takes place in the 1800s, just before the turn of the century. And it follows this girl. Her name is Rachel Kalama. And at 7 years old, she discovers some bumps on her foot. So her parents take her to the doctor to try and figure out what it is. And of course it comes back, and it's the dreaded leprosy. So she is whisked away from her parents and her family and the life that she knows at 7 years old. And she's sent away to the leprosy colony called Molokai. Molokai is how they pronounce it. And she is just terrified because she can't see her parents, she can't see her friends. Her father stays in contact with her for the first couple of years, but then she loses contact with everybody in the outside world. She's raised in an orphanage with other leprosy kids, but the story goes and travels over her entire life. Her journey as she goes from this terrified child, growing up to a rebellious teenager, and then just trying to figure out what really her purpose in life is when she is just stuck on this island and she's never going to be able to leave. There is some romance involved. It's really tragic as she goes through this journey, but it's also a really interesting perspective on the turn of the century and how that affects people in a different culture and this world that she's living in. And when it started off, they treated the people on Molokai, well, like lepers, but like they treated them like subhuman. The food rations were really awful and they didn't really have good housing. And they just kind of dumped them off there and was like, do your thing. And by the end of the book, they've been fighting for these conveniences and fighting for their rights to become, citizens of Hawaii. And with the turn of the century, electricity comes along and there's a lot of advances in medicine. And so by the end of the story, there's a lot of change from the way that this story started out. And it's a really beautiful story of following her life. And finally, we have They Called Us Enemy. And this is a graphic novel. It's written primarily by George Takei. This is his memoir. Of course, George Takei is really famous for being on Star Trek. He's also become really famous these last few years as an advocate for LGBTQ rights and a lot of things like that. This is the story of when he was a child and his family was taken to an internment camp. So imagine waking up in the middle of the night and the police are at your door and they make your family pack up everything that everything that you can carry, and they take you to a racetrack of all places, and you have to live in a horse stall for a few days. That's how the story starts out, and it only gets worse from there. The internment camps, the Japanese internment camps in the United States, are something that a lot of people like to gloss over because it's an uncomfortable subject. We like to focus, when it comes to World War II, we focus on the Holocaust, we focus on what the Germans did to the Jews. We don't like to talk about what we were doing to our own citizens. And while it wasn't quite as bad as what they were doing, it was still really, really awful. They put the Japanese in these really tiny, cramped camps, and they were work camps, and they didn't treat them like citizens of the United States. They made them go through all of these tests to prove that they were citizens, that they were loyal. And they made them, some of them, like sign their rights away. And it's a really, really sad story, but it teaches you a lot about a part of our history that you probably haven't really heard of. The graphics in this are the black and white grayscale, so it kind of adds to that somber tone. But it's also kind of childlike because the perspective is from George as a child. And as he grows older, the scenes start to get a little bit darker. And then towards the end of the book, they start going through the legislation and things that eventually freed them, and then how that impacted his life. So they start to get a little bit more mature and older as the story goes on. So it's a really interesting book. It's a quick read. It's got, like I said, it's a really great historical fiction novel. It's more nonfiction than it is fiction, but it's still the graphic novel. So all of these books are amazing historical fiction time travel books.